Hello and welcome back. We have a color theory demo today, and what I'm going to cover are the basic tools of color theory. I'm not going to get too caught up in specifics of details at this point, but I'm going to cover how we see light. For the first few minutes I'm going to cover all the charts, and then we're going to get to painting. So on the left hand side of your screen we have the images that I'm working with. We have the reference, which I did not shoot. I grabbed that from the internet. I was looking for a very basic shape that we could work with. The trees have a basic kind of roundness to them. The grass, a flat plane, and then our tower, an 8-sided tower, and then the base of it very blocky. And then of course our sky plane. Down in the lower right, I've labeled how the objects are lit and how we look at the sky and its color shift as it's changing from top to bottom, as well as from left to right. We have the color wheel, which you'll be watching change, and I believe because I imported these over in from Camtasia, you won't see the cursor all the time, which kind of makes it tough to follow along with every move that I'm making here. And that's why I'm not making this into a painting demo. This is more of a color demo so that you can understand the process of thinking as we're picking colors. And then I have this chart with information, and this is a really important chart of information. I think one that we can add to this is temperature, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So types of colors we have to consider when we're making representational art. We have local color, the color of each object. We kind of have a yellowish tower, and as it gets lower to the ground it kind of gets yellow-orange, which is a result of the light source, the direct light source, the sun, and bounce light, but we'll talk about that in a second. We have our direct light source, which is our sunlight, and that's kind of a yellow-orange color at a very light value, closer to white. We have our indirect light source, which is blue, the blue sky, and that changes temperature as it goes from the top of the screen to the bottom, or from the top of the image to the bottom. That's how the sky works outside. And then we have bounce light. And the bounce light is anything close to something else that has a color to it and is lit by the direct sunlight, and that thing is near a shadow pattern on another object, and whatever that thing might be is going to bounce its local color into the shadows, so it changes the temperature or changes the feeling of the shadows. In this case, the tower is sitting on the ground plane, and the ground plane is orangey, so towards the bottom of each of those pillars the color shifts towards an orange-like hue. As it moves upward towards the sky, it's affected by the blue sky. And then the rest of the tower all the way up to the top has a bit of blue in it. And so the way that we think about that is our direct light source is really powerful. That takes over on the lit side. And then our indirect light source is also a light, but because it's not as bright as the sun, it ends up being a much darker value, which is our shadow color. So we could say that our shadows are weaker light sources than our direct light source is. So when we're looking at this, yes, we have shadows being cast, but those are also illuminated by our indirect light, the blue sky. We have our color properties to think about. Hue, our type of color, yellow, orange, red, blue, etc. Value, the lightness or the darkness of that color. Chroma, the intensity of the color, how vibrant is the color versus how dull is the color. And then what we are painting, we're painting light and we're painting shadow. What we're painting is, in our light, is a direct light source plus the local color. And then in our indirect light, we have our indirect light source plus our local color, plus, in some cases, the bounce light coming from other objects. So those are our recipes that we're going to be working with. Now, the only other part that I didn't mention here is temperature. And I should have put that in there as well, because that to me is a color property. You're determining from any hue what temperature it is. So that means a yellow can be warm or cool, an orange can be warm or cool, a blue could be warm or cool, a purple any of the colors on the color wheel can have a warmness or a coolness to it. And that's also something that we have to consider once we start picking our colors. Now I put a value slider in here, and I put an impressionistic color wheel, and this is the color wheel that I teach in my color theory class, which is a really good color wheel to learn from because it helps you identify a number of different things, color properties, the intensity of color as well. It teaches you something about how color in an impressionistic way has value to it, and there's a value range from the brightest value to the darkest value, and that descends on both the warm and the cool side of the color wheel. And then in our image that we're painting, what I've done is I've marked down with numbers the value that we're going to be picking as we look at each space in the picture plane. We can identify with its temperature, its value, its hue, and its chroma. So this is how we're going to begin painting. Now let's go ahead and get started with the painting. So we'll start painting here, and I kind of make the mistake of starting down here on the column, but that's just me kind of having a little brain fart before I begin my painting. What I really want to be doing here is starting from the background. So we'll start with the sky. And I paint from the top of the sky down to the ground plane. Now, if we think about this in traditional paint, what we're thinking about here is the shift in temperature. And we can actually identify each band of color in the sky with a specific type of color out of the tube. So if we're thinking about the top of the sky up here as I'm starting to block in, that part of the sky has a little bit more reddishness in it. We can say that it's coming from an ultramarine color. So it's a deep blue, but it's closer to the sun. And because it's getting closer to the sun, it is warmer. So warm towards the top. And then as we move down towards the middle plane of the sky, the middle section is what we would call cobalt blue. And cobalt blue is a colder blue. It's kind of the pure blue in the blue family. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of warm influence to it or a cool influence to it. Now, that's relative, because when we get into cerulean blue, and that's the color I'm painting now, down towards the ground plane, cerulean blue kind of has a greenish hue to it. It's colder. And so we go from warmer to colder as we descend in the blueness of the sky. Now, as we get closer to the ground plane, we're looking through the sky dome. As we're looking up above our head, we're looking at the sky dome. So there's a pureness to what's above us versus an impurity of color as we're looking out towards the horizon line. Lots of atmosphere is getting in the way. And as we get lower to the ground, that atmosphere starts to warm up a little bit. And it'll change hue in that warmth depending upon where we are. If we're out in the mountains, or if we're in a valley and maybe the valley just had a fire, or maybe it's just on a very clear day, or we're way up in the mountains, or we're in a city, that color is going to change. In this case, it starts to shift towards a really warm color. And that warm color is kind of a reddish color by its hue. So you can see in the color wheel here, I picked a gray that has a red color to it. And then I start color picking back and forth between the blue sky and the reddishness in the clouds. Now, clouds are filters. So what they're doing is they're filtering the sun, which is a warm temperature. The thinner the clouds, the more influence they're also going to have from the blue sky. So there's two things taking place. We have this warm filter filtering the sun, and then depending upon its opacity or its transparency, the clouds are going to get warmer or cooler. Now when they get really dense, they start to cool off and they start to take on the color of the indirect light. As they get thinner, or if they're on the direct lit side, they're going to have an influence of the sunlight. In this case, we have really thin veiled clouds, and they are filtering the sun. Because they are a lower value, they are not going to be yellowish or orange. They're going to be more reddish in their filtering. And this does have to do with the value of the object. And then as we get into the background, the same thing's kind of happening. There's two things happening. One, it's filtering the warm sky, and two, it's kind of a haze or a local ground color bouncing up the smog, the particles in the air, and all sorts of other good things taking place back there. So it's also going to warm up a lot more. And as I'm picking those reds, you can see how they relate to each other from the photograph over into the painting. They are very similar to each other. Now we move on to the tower, and unlike normal painting, which I will do on my own time, in the way that I paint my own pictures is that I start from the shadows and I work to the lights. I'm not really sure what possessed me today to start with the lights, but I started with the lights. And I don't think it really matters so much when you know what you're looking for and how to pick the color. But there's still a process that you want to try and resolve by going from dark to light, especially on a white canvas, because white is as bright as you're ever going to get. And we need the other end of the value spectrum to really understand what value range we're working with between the light and the dark. So in this case, we have this yellowish tower. And as you've seen, I've been picking yellows that have kind of a yellow and a yellow-orange in them. The yellow-orange, as we get closer to the base of the tower, is bounce light coming from the roof of the lower blocks and then from the ground plane. And then there's a yellow nature to the brick work. And as that yellow ascends into the sky, it cools off a little bit. Now there's probably some weathering going on there as well. There's some atmospheric influence taking place, and so it's cooling that off. Then we move into the ground plane, and the ground plane has more of an orangey look to it than the tower has a yellowish look to it, and that's going to shift and change a little bit as I start adding additional values into it. And as I start to add other colors around it, it won't look so orange anymore. This is relative to each color. Well, each color is relative to each other, and they change in their hue, or how colorful something is, if you add other colors next to it, and those colors are more chromatic or grayer, they're going to alter, as well complementary to the color that you're picking, they're going to alter the colors that you're looking at. You can see that it started off really orange-like, and now it doesn't look as orange anymore because the green has complemented that color and it's balancing them out to each other. Now going back up into the tower, as we're rounding the tower, going from the walls that are lit from the sun to the walls that are not lit from the sun, the color shifts in temperature just slightly. So on the adjacent walls, they are not as yellow anymore. They take on sort of a yellow-orange color. Now this is what I call eclipsing. It's when the light is no longer direct with the surface or perpendicular to the surface, and the planes get what we call planal to the light source, they start to lose intensity of color. And that means, like on the color wheel, they start to drop in value. They go from more of a yellow to a yellow-orange to an orangey tone. And then we get into the shadows, and the shadows are influenced by the blue sky. So the blue of the blue sky plus the yellow kind of makes a greenish hue. And as long as I get the value correct, the color can shift ever so slightly, but it's more important that the value works. So I'm blocking in down below on the tower now, and I'm starting to put some of that munge from the weathering on the bricks onto the building, and then I'm also putting some bounce light into the lower half of the shadows on the shaded side of each of these little blocks. And you can see in the shadows they go from greener up top to more orangey down below. So there's kind of a hue shift as things are changing from in elevation. And then I'm thinking about that munge and what temperature it is. The first thing I'm doing is getting the value correct, and then I'm going back in and I'm making adjustments to the temperature. Now I started all of it off cooler because of course the indirect light source is lighting it, so that blue light plus whatever darkness there is going to kind of make an optical green color. And then I go back in and I start making some adjustments to it and warm up a few areas as the munge changes from indirectly lit to bounce light. The inside of the doorway kind of has a dark warm color to it, kind of a brownish color, although it's really black looking. And then the shadows below the tower and being cast by the tower kind of have a deep blue quality to them. Now I'm going into the trees, and the trees have a warm side to them, and then they cool off. And like I said earlier, they're kind of a blue-green, but blue-green with the warm sun is going to shift them slightly towards a more olive complexion. And it might not be easy to see at first glance when you look at these trees, because our eyes might not be receptive to all the color changes going on in there. But if you really look closely, you can kind of see how rounded those trees really are. Now with the warm light source, we're going to have cool shadows. So I've picked kind of a blue-purple for the shadows, and you can see that there's a major difference between the light and the shade. And that's one, because of the value, but two, because of the temperature shift. And as long as that temperature shift works, we can keep the values as close together as we need to. But in reality, that temperature is what makes it optically shift and make it look a lot further apart in value than they really are. It's the same with the tower as well. By going from warmer to cooler, although I haven't shifted value too much, and I am going to go back in and darken the values later, the shadows truly look like shaded sides to the objects that we're painting, because there's a big difference in temperature between one and the other. Now I'm going in and doing a little bit of subtle work on the trees, and then I'm adding in a little bit more of the layering and the clouds in the background. And again, I'm picking the difference between temperatures. So as I go closer to the ground plane, you can see that it does shift towards a cooler temperature. And as it moves up a little bit higher, it gets warmer. Then there's these little statues on top of the tower. Those are on the cool lit side. They have more of a greenish hue to them. And then there's ever so slight little edges of warmth on the warm lit side of each of them. And as long as we get the temperatures right, they will look like a dimensional object. Then the more whitish type tones that are on this object will become more of a white marble or a white rock. I'm thinking about the value range and the temperature first. So the temperature in the shadow side is going to be cooler. And then as we move from one surface to the next around into the light, they will warm up. I'm doing all the undercuts on the planes up above, and I'm being very loose and very quick about this. I think I sped the video up about 200%, so I'm moving fairly quickly, obviously, in this demo, but I'm also moving quickly when I made the video. The whole painting took about 30 to 35 minutes altogether. I think it was 35 or 36 minutes tops. And it's really just about identifying colors. So I'm not being accurate with a lot of the drawing. Although I have a line drawing down for me to fill in the spaces, I'm not concerned so much with the perspective, and I'm not so concerned with the shapes being really clean. I'm really doing this more for the purpose of learning about color and helping you see how color, if you can just identify what the color and the temperature of the color is, the value of it, and how it's being lit, what the color of the light sources are, all of that factors into how you choose your colors. Now the color wheel can be a little tricky because there's so many colors to choose from, but if you notice on each hue on the color wheel, there's a half of that hue closer to a red neighbor and half of that hue is closer to a cool neighbor. So the yellow is closer to orange, which I'm picking right now, or was. And then if you look on the other side of the yellow, it shifts closer to green. Green is closer to yellow on the one side, which is warmer, and then it's closer to blue on the other side, which is cooler. Blue is closer to green, which is warmer, then blue is closer to blue-purple, which is cooler, and so forth. So every color has a hue shift to it, and that's the variable length of each of these colors, the visible spectrum of each of these colors, and where we pick within that range of that color spectrum. Is it going to be warmer or is it going to be cooler? So now I'm adding in some of the other shadows, and you can see I've already darkened in the shaded side of this tower just a little bit because I realized that it was a bit faint, and I'll go back in and darken it a little bit more later on. And as I'm adding the undercuts or the side cuts to the shadows within those spaces, they'll optically darken down a little bit further. And I'm thinking about this on every part of the tower that I'm painting. Where is the light source? What is the light source doing? And in addition, because this is so tall, what is the elevation? And as this tower ascends into the sky, it does cool off a little bit because the atmosphere takes over. So it isn't going to be as intense from the bottom all the way up to the top. So we have hue shift and temperature shift going from foreground to background, as well as from lower elevation to higher elevation. And depending upon how murky or how thick the atmosphere is, will determine how much of an influence that atmosphere has on the objects that we're painting. So I'm looking at now doing a little bit of detailing here, and I'm adding in some of the extra planes around on the other surfaces, and by adding those extra planes, they also help shift the values as well as the hues of each of these objects, because remember, colors are relative to one another. So the more colors that we add into the picture, the more everything relates to each other, where with some of those colors missing, the painting might feel very colorful or vibrant, or the painting might feel a little on the dull side, and that's because of what we've picked and how we've related it to the other objects. So, I mean, if we were looking at this from a perspective lesson, I definitely failed on the upper half of the tower and the perspective in there. But again, this isn't what I'm really working towards. I'm not working towards perfect perspective. What I'm working towards is the color lesson and how I'm picking the colors and where I'm picking the colors from. So each little bit that I'm adding into this, I'm considering the direct or indirect light source, the local color, plus the reflected light. And a lot of those eaves up towards the top of the tower change in their underside color because of the direct side bouncing light up into them, and on the shadow side they're going to be a little bit cooler because there is no reflected light bouncing off the surfaces that has the same type of intensity that the sun has when it's bouncing light off of a surface, and then that light is bouncing into other surfaces. But the key here to remember is that there is temperature in every color that you pick. And you have to understand the light source that you're designing from. If you don't think about that light source, then what we end up doing is we end up painting, much of the time, painting only the local colors. The local colors are the colors of each of the objects. And the way that we think about a local color is that a local color is the color of the object if there was a lack of light source influence on it. So a lack of cool and a lack of warm, more of a neutral space that we're looking at that color from. And in this case, we have a yellowish tower, but because the sunlight is on the direct lit side, that yellow shifts more towards an orangey tone. And on the cool side, we have the blue sky influencing the shadows. So that yellow goes from a more vivid yellow to a greenish color because the blue from the sky plus the yellow of the bricks equals the color that we're seeing in the picture. So we have to make judgments now. It's not just light and dark, but it's also temperature based. And if you think about this when you make your paintings are going to have so much more of a believability to them, regardless of how good you can paint or how realistic you paint, because our mind understands how light works without us having an explanation for it. We just take advantage of that. We see everything lit during the day, and we may not pay much attention to the shadows and the lights, but we do understand a sense of reality or believability. So you could get your perspective a little off. You could misinterpret some of your shapes, but that color range is still going to help you make a better painting overall, just because of that believability of light, which is so important when we do make pictures. Now, as I get closer to the end of this, I realize that the sky has just a little bit too much red in it, and I painted about 3 or 4 minutes with what I thought was Camtasia working, but Camtasia actually wasn't working, and I went back to fix it, and it was already painted, so I lost a bit of time. So when you see, well, now we're in this last part of the painting, the sky shifted temperature, I went back in and cooled it off just a little bit to get rid of some of that red. And by getting rid of that red, the sky feels just a little more normal now. It doesn't have like a real awkwardness to it. And it's not like I'm trying to match the photograph, but I'm trying to build a harmony amongst all of the pieces within the painting so that nothing stands out too much. And then last second here, I go back in and make some adjustments to some of the forms because I felt they were a little bit on the graphic side and the light wasn't carrying across the surface the way it should have been. So I will have more of these demonstrations with color theory as we move forward here. This was the first one, and I hope you found this useful.